Welcome back, focused learners. All right, let's just jump right into it. Today's explainer is tackling something that is absolutely crucial, totally massive, and yet surprisingly ignored when we talk about India's growth. We're talking about local governance. Whenever we discuss Indian politics or development, the spotlight almost always hits the Prime Minister in New Delhi or the chief ministers in the various states. But what about the mayors? What about the municipal commissioners and the local councils that are actually running the cities on the ground? Well, fascinating research by political scientist Devesh Kapoor and economist Arvind Subramanian highlights this huge blind spot. They basically argue that local governance in India is structurally suffocated, and as we'll see, that has some massive implications for the nation's economic future and, well, the daily lives of everyday citizens. Now, to figure out where we are today, we kind of have to look back. Check out this quote. Whatever the reasons, the fact remains our local bodies are not, as a rule, shining examples of success and efficiency. Honestly, that sounds exactly like an op-ed you'd read in today's morning paper, right? But it's not. That was actually written all the way back in 1925 by Jawaharlal Nehru, back when he was the chairman of the Allahabad municipality. A whole century ago, literally the exact same complaints were being made about municipal inefficiency in India. Which brings us to the core mystery of this explainer. Why on earth hasn't Indian local governance fundamentally changed in 100 years? Why is it that, despite all this incredible economic growth and modernization everywhere else, local municipal bodies are still running into the exact same structural roadblocks that frustrated Nehru in the 1920s? To figure that out, we really need to look at how power is actually structured in India. Section 1. The Stepchild of Federalism. So whenever people argue about Indian federalism, it's almost always framed as the center versus the states. But there's a huge missing piece to this puzzle, the third tier of government. That's your rural and urban local bodies. The researchers use a really vivid metaphor here. They actually call this third tier the stepchild of Indian federalism. And if local governance is the stepchild, well, the offending step-parent is the second tier, the state governments right above them. State governments exercise this immense, really suffocating level of control over these local bodies, which essentially keeps them weak and entirely dependent. And hey, this isn't just some abstract political science theory. This power imbalance has very real, very tangible stakes for hundreds of millions of people. Just look at what's happening on the ground. You've got Delhi, which the authors point out has basically been an open-air gas chamber for decades because of severe pollution. You've got Bengaluru, this incredible global tech hub, just completely bogged down by immobilizing congestion. These massive urban problems are the direct, visible result of a system where the cities themselves simply don't have the agency to fix their own backyards. So how does this compare to the rest of the world? Section 2. The Global Governance Gap. How does India stack up globally? Well, the disparity is honestly staggering. Think about the United States and China for a second. They are complete polar opposites politically, right? But they share a surprisingly similar approach to how they staff their governments. In both the US and China, nearly 2/3, so about 66%, of all government employees actually work for local governments. But in India, it's hovering right around 10%. That is a massive anomaly when you look at the global stage. The real-world consequence of that tiny 10% figure, it's exactly what you'd think. Because local employment is so incredibly low in India, public services are barely delivered by the third tier at all. Think about it. If you literally don't have the personnel working at the local level, you just can't have effective, responsive local service delivery. It is structurally impossible. Now, take a look at the sheer stagnation at the bottom of this table. This is wild. Between 1961 and 2019, we're talking nearly 6 decades here, the center essentially doubled its tax generation from 5.3% to 11% of GDP. The states did even better. They grew their resources by a factor of 2.5, going from 2.6 to 6.4%. But the urban local bodies, 0.3% in 1961, and exactly 0.3% in 2019. I mean, it's just complete and utter stagnation. They have virtually zero ability to generate their own self-sustaining revenue. Because they can't generate their own tax revenue, the third tier's total expenditure is just abysmally low. It's literally less than 1% of GDP. To put that into perspective for you, the state and central governments spend roughly 15 and 20 times more, respectively. That tiny less than 1% figure means local bodies are forced into complete and total dependence on outside resources. It completely wipes out any independent agency they might have had. Which leads us to probably the most fascinating question of this whole research. Why are these cities so broke in the first place? Section 3. The land revenue track. The researchers attribute this fiscal starvation to a deeper historical issue relating to land monetization. Let's contrast the land strategies of China and India during their major periods of rapid economic growth. When economies grow, land values absolutely skyrocket. That should be a hugely buoyant source of revenue for local governments. The source points out that China successfully fiscalized these rising land values largely by selling it off. It's actually a profound irony if you think about it. A communist country effectively privatized land sales to capture massive revenues for its cities. India, a democracy, went the opposite route. Socialist-inspired land laws ended up fragmenting Indian land, which prevented the state from capitalizing on its own real estate boom. That's what kept land revenues utterly stagnant. To give you a real sense of just how wide that gap became, get a load of this number. By 2020, at its peak, the Chinese government collected 225 times more land revenue per urban resident for local spending than India did. That is 225 times more money flowing directly into city coffers just from leveraging land value. The authors actually trace India's inability to monetize land back to specific ideology and legislation from the 1970s. The Urban Land Ceiling Act of 1976 is cited as a prime example here. It was a law that essentially fragmented land into tiny parcels. Because of that, very little excess land was identified and only a trivial amount was ever actually acquired by the state for public purposes. The Indian state failed to monopolize or monetize its land assets, which completely starved its cities of what should have been their absolute greatest financial resource. And this historical failure, it didn't just leave cities broke, it actively distorted the wider economy. Section 4. State control and black money. See, when you've got extreme scarcity combined with intense land use controls and strict building bylaws, you basically create the perfect breeding ground for rent seeking. The source points out that these severe distortions in the land and rental markets became a primary driver of black money. In fact, the authors argue that literally no sector in India has been as deeply contaminated with black money as the real estate sector. The regulatory environment effectively incentivized a whole underground economy. All of this cascades into what the authors call a low-equilibrium political economy trap. It's essentially a vicious cycle. Step 1, local bodies are unable and unwilling to tax their proximate citizens or monetize land. Step 2, that leads directly to severe chronic resource constraints. Step 3, because they have no money of their own, they become highly dependent on state governments for funding. And finally, Step 4, that dependence is used as a lever of political and administrative control by the states, which results in a total loss of local autonomy and incredibly low managerial capacity. And the reality of this state-level stranglehold is kind of mind-boggling when you spell it out. Despite the 1993 constitutional amendments that were explicitly supposed to empower local governments, city governments today still lack the power to even appoint their own municipal commissioners. They can't appoint their senior management teams. They have barely any say over the promotions or disciplining of their own staff. Actually, even when functions are supposedly transferred to the local level, the staff themselves remain entirely accountable to the state governments back in the capital, not to the local city bodies they're actually working for. So where do we go from here? We've seen the 100-year stagnation, we see the lack of resources, and the suffocating state control. What's next? Section 5. The future of Indian cities. Now, you might be thinking, wait, hasn't the central government tried to step in here? And yeah, to a degree they have. Central schemes like the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission and its successor, AMRIT, have absolutely provided greater financial resources to cities. But the authors point out a pretty crucial flaw. These are top-down initiatives. Trying to tie central funding to structural reforms just hasn't worked, because it completely sidesteps the actual binding constraint here. The real issue is the incredibly weak administrative and technical capacity at the local level, combined with the overbearing role of state governments who just refuse to let go of their power. And look, empowering these cities isn't just about fixing potholes anymore. It's a massive macroeconomic necessity. The source makes a really fascinating comparison when it comes to industrial policy. We usually think of China's economic growth as this huge top-down national strategy, right? But the reality is that most industrial policies in China are formulated and implemented by its cities, not by central bureaucrats. The fierce competition among Chinese cities actually reinforces competition among firms, which drives exceptional economic dynamism. In India, because the cities are so disempowered, that local competition is severely lacking, and it acts as a massive drag on national innovation and overall growth. But it's not all doom and gloom. The researchers do point out some real signs of hope on the horizon. As megacities like Delhi and Bengaluru become increasingly, unlivable for both residents and investors, capital and talent are inevitably going to seek out new destinations. We're already starting to see the really encouraging rise of dynamic Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, places like Bhubaneswar, Coimbatore, Indore, Kochi, Mohali, and Surat. The authors argue that this push and pull dynamic could unleash a powerful competitive sub-federalism. Basically, it might finally force states to empower their secondary cities so they can actually compete for investment. Ultimately, plain old demographics might force the system's hand. India is urbanizing super fast. As this growing urban population is officially recognized in future census data, the resulting shifts in political boundaries are inevitably going to give significantly greater political weight to urban voters. Politicians simply won't be able to ignore the third tier if that's where the vast majority of their voting bloc lives. Which leaves us with one final, pretty massive question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As the nation continues to urbanize and the demands for real economic dynamism grow, will this fierce competition between rising Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities finally force the Indian political system to empower its local governments? Or is the third tier, this vital stepchild of Indian federalism, just going to remain suffocated by state control for another 100 years? The evidence presented here is super clear. The future of India's growth relies heavily on how it decides to treat its cities. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, focused learners. Stay curious and keep seeking the structures behind the headlines.